Tonight we're very excited to welcome and host a conversation with authors Mark Bray and Shane Burley. Both of these writers have tackled the topic of fascism's rise in today's culture and the various ways to fight against it. Mark Bray is a historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism. He is a lecturer at Dartmouth College and was one of the organizers of Occupy Wall Street. His book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, is a comprehensive history of the anti-fascist movement and a handbook on its fight against the alt-right today. Shane Burley is a writer and filmmaker based here in Portland. He has written for In These Times, Think Progress, Roar Magazine, Makeshift, and many other places. He's been interviewed on the topic of fascism by The Guardian, The Huffington Post, and elsewhere. His book is called Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It. Tonight's event will include an audience Q&A after their conversation. A reminder to please make your question a question and make it concise, a question. Q stands for question, and then they will answer the question. After that, they'll be up here to sign books for you. We have books on the carts back over there. Both of the gentlemen will be glad to sign their books for you. And we usually start the line, or we do start the line over here. Not usually, but all the time. Over here. Go in that direction, down that way. There's a lot of you. Please be courteous to each other. Please be respectful to each other. And now please welcome Mark Bray and Shane Burley.
Thanks for all coming out. Really packing them in today. Don't know what you're expecting, but I guess we'll try and give that. So I guess I'll kind of kick things off a little bit. I just want to talk for a second about why I was first interested in this. I was living in upstate New York. I was going to graduate school there. And there was a tour of an author named David Irving. Anyone? That ring a bell for anybody? For those of you that do, I'm sorry. David was, I guess, a semi-respectable historian of World War II, except he was really light on and really easy on Hitler. And over the years, he just became increasingly easy on Hitler, until one day he decided that, you know, it didn't sound like Hitler ordered the death of Jews. In fact, those Jews probably weren't killed at all. And he was, at that point, the biggest figure that had actually kind of said these kinds of things and done it publicly, and really gave away his career to do so, but really emboldened in Germany and the UK and Austria a movement that was growing really, really large, trying to reclaim the Second World War and reclaim the Nazi Party. And so upstate New York, which a lot of people might know is kind of like a post-Rust Belt area, you know, a lot of people have the image of it, of trees and parks, but it's not so much like that. It's more like places where Kodak pulled out 90,000 of their workers, or where Xerox laid off almost everybody. And so what we're seeing is kind of a mini Detroit in cities all across there. And in those areas, things like the National Association for the Advancement of White People, the attempt to reform David Duke's party, the National Socialist Movement, and others were really picking up steam. And also, not to mention the Ku Klux Klan, all over the place. It doesn't, not something you'd expect in New York, but it's definitely the place for it. So we were starting to see that this was going to be a really big event. We couldn't find where it was, and no one really seemed to notice that it was happening. And so in researching it, we started to see that what we kind of had expected a lot of these movements to look like, they weren't really looking like anymore. You know, there definitely were swastika flags, there definitely was the KKK, but it wasn't dominating by any means anymore. And instead, when doing the research, I kept coming across this person, it's about 2010, that no one had heard of, but was doing all these podcasts and started a new website. His name was Richard Spencer. And he had a way of speaking that was just radically different. He didn't sound like a neo-Nazi. He sounded like a boring college professor. Maybe good-looking, well-dressed, definitely came from money. But this wasn't, you know, your dad's white supremacist movement. This was something else entirely. And that, at the time, his website was called Alternative Right, hence the name Alt-Right that kind of got shortened and kind of entered the culture in about 2015. Right before Trump really took off, but when places like 4chan and Twitter were starting to pick up this message. And this was much different. You know, this actually took its lines not so much from the KKK of the past, but instead European nationalist movements that had been rebranding themselves for decades. You know, they didn't want to look like the failures of World War II. They didn't want to look like people who ran gas chambers. they wanted to look like college professors. They wanted to argue with Marxist college professors. You know, if there was going to be leftist books written, they were going to write books. If leftists were going to have public speeches, they were going to do the same thing. Why wasn't their point of view just as important as the left's? And that was what the tradition they wanted to bring over here. And that was something that they were building for a number of years before this really got started. And it wasn't until Trump and kind of the snarky internet culture entered and made it a little bit shorter, made it a little easier for people to pick up on, and that's what really gave it the steam. And then what we saw with the kind of big populist rise in the US, you know, one that came here with Trump, but was happening all across Western Europe, in France with the Front National, Brexit in the UK, in Germany, Sweden, Norway, Austria, happening all over the place. A real revolt against immigrants, a revolt against an increasingly diverse society. That was happening here, and the alt-right was just ready and kind of poised to take that on. And in a lot of ways, it's that world that we entered when we're talking about anti-fascism, in a world where it wasn't just these KKK groups. There were the groups that were, you know, kind of what we thought were segregated to the past or in different parts of the country. This is everywhere, liberal cities. It's happening at rates that we haven't seen since the 20s, at large organizations, and also just diffuse populations of people who are committing to very serious white nationalist politics and trying to bring it up kind of out of the basement. And so I think in a lot of ways that's where both of our books kind of pick up off of. I don't know if we want to jump into a little bit of that.
I'll talk a little, sure. Hi everyone, this is really great. Everyone says, oh, Portland's a rad city, but wow, this is an impressive turnout. So it's really exciting to be doing this presentation along with Shane, and this is the first presentation for your book?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so that's...
the book's technically not out yet.
Yeah, all right. Well, it's over there though, yeah. Pick it up. And you really should, because Shane's been researching these awful people for a long time and knows a lot about them, and the book is really, really great. I had an opportunity to read the advanced copy, and when I was writing my book, and as a way of background, I'm more of a scholar of the left and left responses to the right than the right per se. So when it was time in the book to talk about the alt-right and to try and come up with some sort of a definition or a way of talking about it, I was like, what did Shane write about it? And I was just like, all right, I'm just going to quote Shane for a paragraph. So you should check out what Shane has to say about this topic. But moving on to my work, the kind of genesis of what I wrote was rather different. Basically, without going into all of the unnecessary details, I wrote this book in a very short time period, the beginning of this year, at the urging of the publisher Melville House, in part so that there could be more of a historical context, especially for post-war militant anti-fascism. In English, there's a fair amount written about militant anti-fascism in Britain, a little in the US, much less about elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere around the world. So part of the goal was to sketch it out more in a way that many professional historians have been reluctant to even ask. In part, I think because historians have a kind of disdain for post-war anti-fascism. They kind of subtly buy into the notion that when Hitler lost, that's the end of the story, which of course it wasn't. So in short, the book is a focus on Europe and North America, based largely on interviews with over 60 current and former anti-fascists from 17 different countries. And I want to give a shout out to Rose City Antifa folks who spoke to me for this book. Part of their insights figured into this book. And I have a fair amount of experience with political organizing, but not personal experience with anti-fascist organizing. So the purpose of the book is to bring the kinds of insights and experiences and lessons that folks who have done this work have learned and made them available to people in that way. For those who aren't as familiar with the history, I just want to sort of sketch out a little bit of terminology. So the focus of my book is to sketch the historical origins of the infamous Antifa that are all over the news these days, and explain that this is one specific tradition within the broader anti-fascist history that in English and Italian is often referred to as militant anti-fascism, in German is often referred to as autonomous anti-fascism, in French as radical anti-fascism, that exists at the crossroads, really, I would say, of two related considerations. The first is it's a pan-radical left politics of social revolutionary self-defense against the far right. The importance of this pan-radical element I think was made evident to anti-fascists based on the general inability of the European left to get on the same page to fight the common enemy before World War II. In Germany, for example, the socialist and communist parties were at each other's throats far more than they were against the Nazis. When Hitler took power in 1933, the slogan of the German Communist Party was "First Hitler, then us," because they thought that they could ride the coattails of Hitler into power when he failed in government. They didn't take it as seriously as they ought to have. And that was largely true, I'd say, at a leadership level, not as much at a rank and file level, because the people who were actually under attack were much more likely to advocate for anti-fascist unity and militant responses to it. That was true across Europe. And so, in that sense, it's a pan-radical politics. It's also a politics of direct action. It's a refusal to trust in the state, in the courts, in the police, in legislation to stop the far right. And once again, in the European context, that took an especially important role after World War II, when most socialist and communist parties in Europe argued for stopping the far right through legislation. Their response was, let's just make it illegal. But as the far right started to rear its head again, to target immigrants, to target leftists, to target all sorts of people, militant anti-fascists argued that this wasn't getting the job done. And that's sort of the kind of trajectory that we're tracing here, and has its roots across these different contexts. But I think, especially in talking about anti-fascism in the context of the US, I think it's important to zoom out from this specific definition to look at it more broadly. It's a challenge to define fascism, right? Historians have debated what it means, what it is, what it isn't. But in my book, I think it's important to take a page out of what Ami Césaire said, that to some extent we can think of Nazism as European imperialism, colonialism, and genocide brought home to the European continent. And if we take that as at least one point of departure, not the whole story, but one point of departure, then I think that the explicit anti-fascist tradition under that label can also be seen as one specific variant of a global struggle against white supremacy and genocide. And so in that sense, we can zoom out from the specific militant anti-fascist tradition to look at this struggle more broadly, going back to 1492, back to the first slave ships, and so forth. So I'm gonna leave my comments there, but I think it's important to sort of look at these dynamics in a specific sense, in a broader sense, and everywhere in between.
And I think one of the things that I think we did in both books, in the discussion about where we are right now, is to talk about what it means to have a fascist movement in a country that has a long history of white supremacist violence, where these sorts of things are kind of baked into the Americana that we've all kind of come to know, the history that we have of both American imperialism, of the colonial settler kind of establishment of this country, and has been ongoing, as we see, in the repeated attacks from police and things like that. What fascism does is it makes that kind of underlying inequality explicit. One of the first things that defined the alt-right was that they said human beings aren't equal. It goes in the face of hundreds of years of social progress and says we don't accept that basic premise. Human beings aren't equal. They're not equal as individuals. They're not equal as groups. Groups of people, which is code word for races, aren't equal, and they don't have equal outcomes. And the other thing is about creating this sense that we had to reclaim this old identity, that white identity has been lost in the sea of progress and multiculturalism. In a lot of ways, a rejection and a revolt against all the kind of progress that we've made to kind of target a lot of the foundational white supremacy that built the country. And so when we're talking about militant anti-fascism, it's not enough to just confront this kind of insurrectionary moment. These people are violent, they engage in this thing. But to go further and say, like, what started this in the first place? Do we have to stop just at this beginning? Can we start to also unseat the larger issues and tie them to that larger issue? And I think also, again, to bring back the issue of violence, is to also take their violence very real and sincere. The history of white nationalism in the US, but obviously in Europe and other parts of the world, is the history of terrorist violence, period. It's one thing that you can count on, you can set your watch to it, and you can have as kind of the beats of their history have been these acts of what we also call like seemingly mass violence, or seemingly lone violence, lone wolf violence. Stuff that seems as though it's not planned, but it's actually a direct result of the movement that built it.
Yeah, and just following off of that, I think that by focusing in on what a lot of these alt-right figures are trying to reclaim and reinvest with meaning, it has some clues as to a broader anti-fascist outlook towards social progress. So what do we mean? So whiteness, right? whiteness is a social construct historically that is premised on imperialism and slavery, right? It's in that sense very different from other kinds of racial identities. It seems pretty self-evident to a lot of anti-racists, especially those who are trying to think sort of transformatively, that the abolition of whiteness is a key part of creating a just world, destroying this kind of inherent identity, which doesn't mean killing white people, but the category, right? And so in that way, I think thinking of these kinds of categories and what the alt-right is trying to invest with them, nationalism, racial identity, these kinds of what they claim to be common sense notions that go back in history but actually don't, is sort of like a meta anti-fascist framework, I'd say. Yeah, I just want to throw that out there.
And so I think one of the things I do in my book, and Mark does, is kind of survey different types of anti-fascist organizations, what their approaches have been. The word Antifa is kind of bandied about. I recently read an article about are trans kids the result of Antifa parenting? I don't think that word means what they think it means. And so I think it's a generally unheard of, kind of a confused thing. And so I think when I'm talking about the principles of militant anti-fascism, it's always one that would be willing to go farthest of actually engaging with them, not just in symbolic acts and not just in protests down the street, but if they're there, we're going to be there, and refuse to allow them to just have that open space, to just go there uncontested and to say that their speech is going to just kind of stand up in the community that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think also that the media narrative is a really interesting part of this to talk through on both sides of the conversation, both the fascist side and the anti-fascist side, because it is interesting, one, how the media focuses on individuals with the far right, it seems to me. They're very interested in what Milo Yiannopoulos does, Richard Spencer does, and so forth, but, what groups do we ever hear talked about in the mainstream media on the far right? It doesn't seem that that's very common. Out of Charlottesville, there are plenty of groups that helped to organize the Unite the Right rally. They didn't get a lot of attention at all. So I think that's kind of an interesting way and frames sort of how we think of this in the media. And then of course, obviously on the left, the assumption that Antifa is this solitary organization with a leadership and like a board of directors and CEOs that runs it globally. And it's not. The super soldiers are anyway. And the notion that it's very hard to explain the differences between networks and tendencies and politics and tactics and activities and strategies. Like all these things that in the left world are clearly defined markers. If it's not elections or people holding signs, it's very hard to explain anything else within that context.
And that's why I think it's been hard for the media to cover both sides in general, to understand what does something like the alt-right mean. Does it mean Trump Republican? Does it mean Beltway conservatism or Tea Party? And it took years, really, before these movements were able to be covered in any kind of meaningful way. Even now, it's kind of very frenetic and confusing. The alt-right has always meant white nationalism. It has always meant a very explicit fascist politics. From its beginning, from its founding, they were not shy about this. There was conferences, there's entire book volumes that explained it. But the media coverage kind of avoided doing that because it didn't play into a really understandable history. It's not the KKK, it's not neo-Nazis in the same way. A number of them are neo-Nazis, but it doesn't kind of follow the same trajectory that we've had. And so in a lot of ways, along with the resistance that came with it, we had to start rethinking what it meant to have American politics. It's a really 21st century phenomenon in that it doesn't just rely on kind of the old party politics of European fascist movements or the Klan style, underground organizations exclusively. A lot of these are brand new. They're trying new things, just like the left is, and they're coming at things from a whole different approach. And people really weren't ready outside of those militant anti-fascist organizations who kind of were able to see this coming and kind of knew what these organizations looked like by looking at their ideas.
Yeah. What else do you want to talk about? I mean, maybe we're approaching the throwing it open to see what these folks are interested in talking about.
Yeah, what do people think? You want to do questions now?
Hi, my name is Tim Titchery, and I'm from the Portland 9/11 Truth Alliance, and the Willamette Week did an article about our group about 8 years ago. I feel I'm part of the Democratic Party, a precinct party person in the Democratic Party. I think I'm more on the left than on the right, but this group...
What was your name?
Tim Titchery.
Okay. I'm going to cut the question off and we're going to move on to the next person. Okay?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could both just sort of give a definition for fascism, then iterate why exactly you're against it.
That's a very concise question. Yeah. All right, so then we'll take that and one other one, and then we'll answer.
Sure.
A concise definition of fascism and why we are opposed to it. That was the question. Yes.
Yeah, maybe.
So I'm a union organizer, and I know once fair share gets knocked down by the Supreme Court, one of our most vulnerable locals will be rural locals, who are mostly susceptible to these types of alt-right movements. So I'm wondering, what would your advice be to someone who's a union staffer?
Take whichever you want.
So I'll why don't we just go over, I'll just jump with the definition of fascism. So first off, we had a question about what's the definition of fascism, that we're kind of so against it. And then the other question was actually for union organizers, that when fair share comes, basically when right to work comes, and starts to shrink bargaining units, especially in rural areas, what kind of advice would there be for approaching people that might be getting recruited by far-right groups or patriot groups out in rural areas? I think especially here, Harney County, Jackson County, and Josephine County. I'll jump off really quick with the definition of fascism. What I say is I kind of harp on really two things. One is a belief in inequality, that human beings, either as groups or individuals, aren't equal, and that society really should be hierarchical. We should have people dominating over others. That's a really key component, and you can't have it without that. The other one is that identity, that fixed identities, racial identities, gender identities, sexual orientation, these are all defining things, and that people need to they're choosing people before people have chose them. And so that when it comes to something like white identity, whether or not you've decided to be part of this white identitarian movement, it's chosen you. It has chosen your history, your beliefs, your personality. And so that really fixed idea of inequality and identity, those are the really core things I think that you have to have a fascist movement. And those are really inimical to having a multicultural, cosmopolitan society. The left is about a movement towards greater equality. It might come after it in different ways at different times, but that's the fundamental core of it. And you can't have that when you have strict hierarchical divisions and identities that are so fixed that people can't define who they are or create new communities or redefine what society should look like.
Yeah, do you want to take the second one?
I can do it the second one. I think one of the things about it is that it's finding how to connect with the reality of rural America, which is not an easy answer because it's under just full-scale assault at all times. So if we take rural Oregon, we're talking about they're getting rid of post offices, they're getting rid of public services. One thing, for example, if there is an attack in rural Jackson County, someone was stabbed, say, it's going to take hours for the police and ambulances to get there. But you know who will get there? Oath keepers. They will come out. The militia movement actually does provide services and stuff like that. So what's the answer when we're pulling jobs out of there, when state-run programs that a lot of people are employed by aren't out there anymore? And so I think one of the things is finding a way of connecting to people's lived realities and creating a community base there. And that's not an easy thing when you're trying to reach fair share of workers.
I want a contract language.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things is we have to go back out there. It's not going to be good enough to connect like we do with city workers and stuff like that. We're going to have to talk about where the lived issues there, and we're going to have to speak a language that's actually at their experience. And that's not. And I wish I could give a straight line on that because it's not a straight line. There's some organizations that have done it really well. Here, the Rural Organizing Project has done a really good job. Montana, the Montana Human Rights Network. There's a lot of organizations that deal with rural areas and then try to go after them and their economic issues. But the thing is that when we hit fair share, if we hit right to work, rural areas are going to be decimated. If you weaken unions in rural areas, that's probably the only stable jobs that are available in those areas, and when that goes, it entirely goes. And so those are the people that are going to be hit so catastrophically.
Yeah, just a few brief add-ons. Going back to the first question of definitions, as a historian, I'm on the more reluctant end to define things precisely, but I really love what you say, and I agree with all of it. But I think it's also interesting to really think of it when it developed as a context of the immediate aftermath of World War I, of a revolutionary upsurge in Europe, and how it's evolved in ways in different times and places that are also dependent on the context involved. And so in that sense, it's a moving target, and that's why I think some of the conversations where some people will say, well, we should limit the term fascism to talking about those people who agreed with Mussolini, and therefore anti-fascism should only be oriented towards organizing against people who agree with Mussolini on everything, and everything else is sort of off the table, misses how it's a, you can debate whether it's an ideology or not. I'm reluctant to use that term in a very straightforward sense with it, but it is sort of a moving garbage dump of concepts.
It is a garbage dump.
Yeah. So anyway, point being, especially recently, focusing on the European context for the moment, you know, groups like Casa Pound in Italy, Hogar Social in Spain, Golden Dawn in Greece have tried to provide these services for people who feel abandoned by the left, by the state, and so forth. In Montreal, I learned about a group called Food Against Fascism, which is sort of like a food not bombs, anti-fascism style to push back against efforts by right-wing groups to provide these services in the other direction. So I think that's sort of like another way of thinking about the anti-fascist struggle, is simply building a strong working class movement that can make it so that people turn to their coworkers and their neighbors to organize networks of mutual aid rather than blaming immigrants or whoever.
I think also, one of the things that's important, I think, to recognize is that when a lot of people turn towards these far-right movements, it is sort of, in a way, kind of a twisting of class consciousness. There's a reality about what's happening in rural areas, in urban areas. There's a reality that there's just a full-on assault on working people. And so there's an expression of that in this, of scapegoating as a kind of sort of looking for someone to blame and looking for some place to put that anger. And be able to speak that language and start talking about things like what's your actual working class interest, what do you have a lot greater interest to banding together with coworkers and is blaming them for their backgrounds, things like that. Having that kind of conversation and bringing it back to the kind of core, especially of labor organizing, which is solidarity between coworkers to confront issues directly. And that's, I personally think that's still a message that's powerful with people of that background. So I'm going to do two at a time, and then we'll just go with it.
How do you feel the impact of leftist gun groups such as Redneck Revolt and Trigger Warning could be beneficial to the movement of anti-fascism?
Historically, which anti-fascist strategies or tactics were the most effective, or which ones were the least effective?
Okay, so the question was about armed anti-fascist formations like Redneck Revolt and Trigger Warning and so forth, and historically what strategies or tactics have been most effective, least effective for anti-fascists. Is that? Let me start talking about the second question. I think all politics are contextual, and I think that's especially true with anti-fascism. So I think that most strategies and tactics have a time and a place with the anti-fascist struggle, and so I'm reluctant to say in a blanket sense that certain forms or methods are more or less effective. End stop. I think that it's useful to learn from other times and places what has worked and what hasn't, but there are different considerations. So, I mean, just one that comes to mind is it was interesting to learn a little bit about the different perspectives on the Black Bloc shown by German and British anti-fascists in the 1990s. So the Black Bloc tactic developed out of the German autonomous movement in the 80s, and it was used by some German autonomous anti-fascists to confront the far right in Germany. I read about this example where some British anti-fascist action members went over to Germany, met with the German anti-fascists, but were reluctant to adopt that tactic at the time because they preferred, from what I read, to dress in what they called casuals, where the police couldn't tell if they were an anti-fascist or a fascist or a quote-unquote football hooligan or what have you. So in that way, they argued against having a group that could be identified as a group by how they dressed. Right? So the different contexts where in the one context, one group felt one way, well, they felt the other. But of course today, if there are video cameras, then it may be confusing at the time to see who the police are, but they can later look at video in a way that, in 1992 in Manchester probably was not feasible. So to sort of conclude one way or another just in the abstraction doesn't make sense. I spoke to a member of the London anti-fascists who explained that he and his comrades will sometimes use a black bloc tactic if there's enough people there, but if it's a small group, they won't. So, and of course it all also has to do, not that this is the only conversation to have, but this is what comes to mind, with what your goals are. What are you trying to appeal to people who have a certain preconceived notion about it? Are you trying to change that notion? Do you not care about that notion? So, and the same thing is true, I think, with what kinds of, and this is sort of, I guess, segueing to some extent into the other question, what kinds of self-defense are appropriate against what kinds of threats? Has everything to do, of course, with are you trying to appeal to a popular consciousness about what kinds of forms of resistance are acceptable or not? Are you trying to challenge that consciousness? Or do you not care about that consciousness? Is that consciousness in some way directed against you because you're part of a group that can't count on the majority of society to actually look out for your interests? So I'm sorry for the long non-answer. But if you want to jump in on any of this.
Yeah, I'll go front and back on that. With trigger warning and redneck revolt, so I know the trigger warning folks very well. I used to live in Rochester, and I think that a lot of what trigger warning is, and for people who don't know, trigger warning is the queer and trans gun club. Queer and trans folks. So in New York State, there's a little bit more restrictive laws about guns here. So they do gun safety, go out to the range, learn how to clean your gun, how to take care of it, what are gun laws, what's appropriate use. Also, how do you know when a situation is a gun situation? Like if someone's breaking into my house, should I have a gun? That kind of thing. So it's a lot of ways about responsible gun ownership and knowing how to use those things. It's a number of things. One is it's a sense of confidence. There's a lot of attacks on queer and trans people. Police were not receptive to it. They were not defending people. Historically, calling the police when you're a marginalized group is not always a safe thing to do. And so I think we need to be real about what people go through when they're facing threats. And so I think that's one thing that's a little bit different than redneck revolt. And for folks who don't know, redneck revolt also often comes to actions with guns, and if patriot groups are going to show up with guns, sometimes they'll show up with guns also. I talked to both for my book, and a lot of the programs that redneck revolt were doing, they do mutual aid programs in rural Appalachia. They do needle exchange, places hit by opioid crisis. They do food exchange programs at like cattle shows and stuff like that. And they table at gun shows. And they table at signs that say things like, we're pro-gun, anti-democrat, pro-labor. It starts a lot of conversations with a lot of people by doing that. I think since I wrote about it, a lot of kind of like, back and forth about how effective or how honest that approach has been. But I still think that there's a logic to that's really sound. And I think the public display of weapons, I think right at this point, it remains to be seen how effective it has been at reaching out to some communities. I think it works really well in some places, and I think it works really poorly in others. But I think, again, it comes back to this idea of creating movements that don't just rely on the state that hasn't always been as supportive of people or as a safe, neutral body. And I think in a lot of ways, people having those weapons training, whether or not they ever use them for any reason, which most people don't, but feeling like they have self-sufficiency and stuff has a logic to it. And I think it brings it back to the idea of militant anti-fascism as people coming together with each other and not just depending on this outside body that may or may not have their interests at heart. Look at the hands.
Okay. I was just wondered what either of your thoughts are on how important is it for people who want to do anti-fascist organizing to understand how they think or get into their heads or whatever.
Yeah, so a lot of the coverage of Antifa and even mainstream or even whatever the ruralish media seems to not reflect the reality of what I've seen, at least here in Portland. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about if you agree with that, if you think that that's because reporters are maybe zeroing in on the most negative or the most dramatic things that they're seeing, or if that's because the alt-right is out there doing a really good job of creating stuff that's kind of infecting its way into mainstream coverage.
Can I jump in on the second question?
Yeah, maybe repeat the question.
Yeah, so in short, a really bad job covering anti-fascism. Why is that? Is it because the alt-right is sort of framing the narrative, or is it because the liberal media is terrible, or so, along those lines, right? So yes, yes, right? The media has, and generally still are, doing a very bad job. I think that the reasons that they're doing a bad job have a lot to do with why they tend to do a bad job on radical politics more generally. I mean, there's a number of reasons that I'm not going to list them in the order that I would if I could think it out, but just what comes to mind. One is that most journalists just don't know a lot about radical politics. Most don't. And the ones that I've spoken to really don't. And it sometimes requires like a 40-minute conversation just to lay the framework of the different tendencies and tactics and strategies and histories that go into making this before you can even actually talk about what's going on. If you want to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, this brings back, I was interviewed in the Atlantic a number of weeks ago, and thank God they cut my quote, because it was just an atrocious article. But it took a really long time for them to understand why people wouldn't just call the police some fascists. I mean, we're talking about a senior editor who's been a reporter for 30 years. He was like, well, why don't they just call the police? And I was like, look, how many reports have you doing in this issue alone on police shootings? Like, do you think that the police are going to be a neutral body to everybody? And getting those ideas across. And in the article, he said that both Antifa and the alt-right are anti-liberal ideologies. And I was like, well, that actually gets at something. You're right, it is an anti-liberal ideology. It's a radical left ideology, one that is suspicious of capitalism and the state as institutions that are going to protect people in any and all situation. And I think, yeah, I think it's fundamentally about how are they going to learn about those things. You know, I've worked for a newspaper before. You know, you're doing tons of articles all the time. Like, most of these people don't have a background in any of this stuff, and so they're doing it as fast as possible. I tend to actually kind of they know not what they do approach to it, because I think frankly they really don't. And that goes back to the alt-right itself. It took years for even really generally good publications to publish anything that was remotely true about it. I mean, there were authors doing think pieces about the alt-right, saying that it was you know, a Catholic movement, or that it was a movement of you know, Southern Texans, and like, I mean, they really it took a long time to get a sense of this, because it was so outside their frame of reference. They had never seen anything that looked like this. And actually, it brings up the question over here. I think it's incredibly important, because when you're organizing to fight the Klan and the Klan doesn't show up, you don't have anything left, you know? And so I think understanding how they see themselves and what their priorities are is the most important thing. And that way, because I hear folks from Rose City Antifa say this a lot, is that all Nazis are fascists, but not all fascists are Nazis. And I think preparing for that and understanding that gives you kind of the tools you need to make sense of what's about to happen.
Yeah, and just to follow up a little more, it seems to me that a lot of this has to do with the question of objectivity, quote unquote, in journalism. And there are some topics that journalists clearly feel like they do not have to be, quote unquote, objective about, having to do with political violence, having to do with, quote unquote, extremism. And so in that way, there have been articles written about anti-fascists where they can just say all sorts of erroneous and very value-heavy comments and feel like they're still doing their journalistic duty, while ironically at the same time sometimes giving the far right much more of a kind of hands-off approach of like, well, they say they're this, they say they're that. And the other thing, of course, is, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. Spectacle is the focus. This is a profit-driven incentive that dictates what's going on. And even the kind of short window of time when the media pushed back against Trump's good people on both sides comment, that was sort of, for a brief window of time, there was a new hot take of, oh, there is no moral equivalency, followed up by the need for a new take, because these pundits always need to come up with a new take to fill their Monday morning obligation. The new take is, there is a moral equivalency, and then we've been off and running with that. And I think I'll just add that I think that there can be value in trying to fix these narratives, but it's always an uphill battle, and you know, radical movements are never going to get the mainstream media on their side. And yeah, of course, it's hugely important to understand one's enemy and to get inside their heads. The anti-fascists that I spoke to emphasize the importance of a wide variety of tactics that do that. Infiltration, doxing, making them feel like they're constantly under pressure, like their neighbors hate them, like their boss might fire them, like they might get kicked out of their university, like they are a pariah from society. You need to understand how someone thinks in order to be able to do that, and understand the differences in far-right thought. In the book I talk about, I think to some extent, part of the failure of the anti-fascist movements of the 20s and 30s to some extent to adequately respond to the threat right away was there was an assumption that fascism was just a wrinkle of traditional 19th century conservative reactionary politics. In the 20s, you see some anti-fascists comparing fascists to the black and tans in Britain or the white guards in Russia and so forth. And there was an assumption that, sure, reaction comes and goes. We've seen the repression of the Paris Commune. We've seen the repression of the 1905 revolution in Russia. It comes and goes. This is not essentially different, but it was. And so I think for that reason, it is important to be attuned to changes in far-right thought to assess how we respond to it.
In that 40-minute conversation that, beginning an interview like that, what are your first few minutes of conversation to try to get them to see what you're talking about?
You get one on there too.
Yeah, modern technology and future technology. Do you think that's going to aid in fascism kind of taking over, or aid more in the anti-fascist kind of upward movement?
All right, well, I'll start with the first one. So the first question was going back to the conversation about having to speak to journalists sometimes for 40 minutes just on laying a groundwork for them to be able to talk about the issue. What are some of the first comments about that? For me, I often tend to focus on really taking a step back and being like, look, the way the media and the way much of the public assesses anti-fascism is based on the assumption that anti-fascists and liberals share the same premises about politics, about society, about the future, about all sorts of things, and they usually don't. So to assess anti-fascists based on a liberal rights framework, based on an electoral framework, based on an assumption that like the ultimate goal is for the Democratic Party to get into office, all these kinds of things don't actually reflect the kind of social revolutionary and, as Shane pointed out, illiberal political foundation that plays into viewing fascism as an enemy to be eliminated as a political thought, and not just sort of a difference of opinion that we can have a polite conversation with. And so for me, that's like a prerequisite for understanding or talking about any of this, is to be like, if you want to be critical, fine, but be critical on the terms that the people are laying out who are doing this, and they're trying to create a different kind of world. Militant anti-fascism is anti-state, or at very least state skeptical, at the very least, right? And because if you are someone who believes the state can solve all problems, then you probably wouldn't take this route, right? And so that's another thing is it goes back to the why don't you just call the police angle. Laying out these foundations, I think, is important. So I'll leave it at that. But,
my first few minutes are always, aren't these guys nuts? Let's talk about how nuts they are. Like if we're gonna agree on that point. And so I think it is about creating that sense of foundation with them, and why we don't just, for example, want to take hate speech laws as being like the be-all end-all, or hate crimes laws and that kind of thing. And I think the other thing about that is to say, like, actually it's also not just about how we respond to this, but it's about what we want tomorrow and the next day. Do we want to build up movements and communities that are going to be strong, not just because there's like a strong police apparatus, even if you thought that was neutral, but are they going to be able to be strong and respond to that? And in a lot of ways, we want to not just have a response here to this one incident, but to be able to go on and actually go after these underlying issues, to really start to confront this stuff, and to see what it's like to have solidarity between neighbors and neighborhoods, so that in the future we have stronger movements that are able to kind of crush these things before they're growing and become real violent threats to people.
one other thing to throw out with that is to talk about anti-fascism as a long tradition with a global history, and to say, okay, if you want to assess it, look at the evidence of these movements and how they've done it, who they've been organizing against. The media likes to talk about everything as if it's new and without precedence, and this is totally not that. So yeah, and then just the technology question, I don't know if technology helps the right or the left more. I think it depends on how you use it. In general, I'm kind of skeptical of the sometimes I think unreflectingly pro-technology perspective of some leftists that the internet will set us free, or that social media will set us free. I push back against it, but I'm sort of in the middle about that. I'm not sure. So maybe you have more of an opinion.
Well, yeah, I think what we saw is that technology, the alt-right couldn't have existed in the time before technology to create decentralized movements where a lot of people are anonymous, where they share ideas that essentially become more and more radical as time goes on. That couldn't have existed when you had mail order, stuff where it's really hard to get to know people. You have to go to like a weird underground meeting. And so their movements blew up in ways they couldn't have ever had before. At the same time, though, there's been such mass platform denial against them. Let's take since Charlottesville. We have the murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville on August 12th. August 13th, half of these websites get their platforms pulled. They start getting their social media accounts pulled. MailChimp. They're getting kicked off Tinder even. So you can't even swipe on them. It's really, really hard for them to operate. They have a period of time when they're on the same platforms that politicians and journalists are on, but they're not anymore, and they're increasingly off and off. And that's only through organized pressure. It didn't happen because the technocrats that run Silicon Valley decided they agreed with us. Most of them definitely don't. And so that ended up being an avenue that we were able to kind of take charge and take a lead in. So I think the actual answer is that I don't say technology is always neutral, but I do think that what happens depends on us entirely. So I think we can take one last set of questions, and then we're going to have to kind of in the back of it. Okay, straight in the back. You?
Okay, I was just wondering, why does it seem like the alt-right is better than the radical left at getting people with disparate ideas to band together under one thing, and what can we do to maybe take some ideas from that, and as far as organizing goes, and left unity, essentially? How do we get that to work when they seem so much better at it than we do, and what are we doing wrong?
Let's get one more. Who? Me? Anybody? Right there. With glasses. Yeah, you.
Sorry. What I was interested in asking, sort of a follow-up to your question, actually, about the media portrayal and sort of the reasons for why there is so much poor coverage, I guess you could say, or bad coverage of anti-fascism, because after the May Day actions in Portland, which I won't get into, just to be brief, the entire editorial board of the Oregonian, which I think is the largest newspaper in the state, definitely in Portland, I'm pretty sure, and is sort of the most mainstream newspaper, I think, that I can think of, signed an editorial that they penned saying, it was entitled, "Portland must be done with punk fascists," and it referred specifically to these people that they then doxed, that were arrested, that were part of a black bloc on May Day. So, I think there is definitely, I guess, there is some unintentional aspect to it, but how do you think we should deal with and try to construct actual correct counter-narratives to things like that, which are very intentionally trying to misuse the word?
Yeah, sure. That's both of them are kind of perplexing questions. I think on the one hand, this idea of the punk fascist, that anything that someone doesn't like is a fascist, or even that just I think that's authoritarian, or that didn't go through the liberal democratic political system, I think is appropriate, therefore it is fascism. And in a lot of ways, that's the same problem we're having with reporters in general, of just not really having a concept of anything outside of a very narrow scope of what political activity is. I would say that we should bunker down and really explain it to them, but I don't think they're going to hear it. And in a lot of ways, I think it's being able to communicate our messages clearly and effectively to people, to be able to have that kind of outlet, to be able to have that conversation, and to continue organizing and making that clear. I don't think we're going to get the editorial board of the Oregonian on board with it. The people that write that are not going to be of the political tradition that's ever going to hear that.
Yeah, and to jump on that, similar problems happened with Occupy, which the sort of questions of liberal values were not necessarily in as much of attention as it is with this conversation. It was still a problem. So it seems to me to some extent the question is building, through organizing, relationships that are durable and tangible enough to survive bad media coverage, so that people who read these editorials will say, I know that that's bullshit because I know these people, I know the work they do, I have these connections to them, because the media is, even when it's supportive, it is capricious. And so, yeah, it's useful to explain this stuff, but I think it's always an uphill battle and you're always gonna roll back down it. I'm not sure that the alt-right does a better job of building unity than the left. I mean, it seems like a lot of these counter-protests against the far-right have people of all sorts of tendencies and parties that rarely agree on anything showing up. Of course, there's disagreements about what to do once we show up, but nevertheless, I mean, showing up seems to me to be important, and the efforts of the Unite the Right did not unite the right. Of course, there's unanswered questions about how to be better at that, but I'm not sure if I accept the premise of them being better at that.
Yeah, if you have any ideas about how to find left unity, you call me up. I think one thing that's important about it is that the one thing that they do have is that they are under attack in a lot of ways. I know that they're not under attack for being white or for anything like that, but they are pretty roundly decried at this point. And there's a really big turn in this country towards getting involved. So after Charlottesville, what was next? Boston, about 150 of them, a lot of them Proud Boys, were going to come and do a rally. Well, they were met by 40,000 people. When was the last time you saw 40,000 people meet 150? I mean, they really, really are in a minority. And in a lot of ways, that can kind of crystallate them to support because they have such little of it. But I think we need to remember that just because we have a large majority, it doesn't mean we're organized and ready to go.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks, Shane. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Mark's going to take a little break, but he'll be up here to sign books. Shane's up here to sign books, too. If you don't have a book, there's some back by the info desk. Form a line right over here, please. Thanks for coming out again.